Hi, I'm Tracy Ackerman, the designer and creator behind KeLibu. If you're new here, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you always know when I post new content. Today, I'd like to talk to you about a really valuable skill, walking a pattern. When I first started sewing, I'd get very frustrated because sometimes my seams wouldn't line up or my notches wouldn't match, and I thought it was something that I was doing wrong. And while part of the time it probably was user error, a lot of the time it was because there was problems with the pattern. When I started learning how to alter and ultimately design my own patterns, I did a lot of research online, and I stumbled across a blog called Fashion Incubator. It's written by a woman named Kathleen Fasanella, who's a commercial pattern maker. She often talked about walking a pattern, and I had no idea what that meant until she did a blog post explaining how to do it. Basically, once you've cut out your pattern pieces, you move them together along the seam line to make sure that everything lines up properly, the seams are the same length, and everything's going to fit together. This can save you a lot of headache and frustration, especially if you're working with expensive fabrics. If you walk your pattern before you start cutting it out of your fabric, you can identify any problems there might be and figure out how to correct them before you start constructing your garment. So I'm going to show you today how to walk a pattern and give you a few tips and tricks. Let's get started. I'm going to be showing you how to walk a pattern with one of my own. This is the Back to Basics shirt for a girl for all time. The first thing you're going to want to do is check the easy seams. So shoulder seams, it's pretty easy to see how they're going to go together. Line them up, make sure that one isn't wider than the other. If it is, that's a pretty easy fix. You can just take down the seam on one part. So if my shirt shoulder was a little bit wider than my on the front than it is on the back, I could just make a little mark where it needed to end and redraw the line and cut that off my pattern piece. Side seams also pretty easy to line up, so you want to make sure that you're getting the junction of the seam there lined up with the junction of the seam there, and make sure that it fits. Again, if the back is a little bit longer than the front or vice versa, you can adjust your pattern so that the side seam is the same length. With my sleeve, the first thing I'm going to check is to make sure that the sides are equal. So I'm just going to bend it over like that and make sure that they match up, and they do. And then the last thing that I would check on this pattern is to make sure that the sleeve is going to fit into the armscye properly. Now, because I'm going to be turning this pattern piece over at some points, I've transferred the seam lines onto the back of my piece as well as the notch so that I have those as guidelines, and I just held it up to the window to do that so I could see from the other side. This sleeve happens to be equal on both sides. Sometimes, especially in people clothing, you have a front and a back side of the sleeve. So if that's the case for your pattern, you have to make sure you're walking the correct side against the right armscye. The first section I'm going to check is this side of the sleeve against the back armscye, and as I said, both sides of the sleeve are the same, so I could have gone either way. This notch is meant to line up with the seam line junction here at the shoulder, because this part will be sewed to the front. So I'm lining my notch up with that seam line junction, and then I'm carefully just going to pivot this pattern piece around to make sure that it lines up the end. Now this can be tricky at first, but it just takes a little practice. Basically, you want to make sure you're putting pressure with your finger on the part that is lined up and pivoting, and then you move your finger, pivot again, and keep going until you make it all the way around. And I know that these pattern pieces fit, but you can see I didn't quite make it to the end there. So I always walk the pattern at least 3 times to make sure that things are lined up properly and it wasn't an error that I made when I was pivoting. So you can see that time it lined up. Another thing that you can do if you're having trouble with the pivoting is to measure with a flexible tape measure. Now, the important thing to remember when you're doing this is that you have to line up the edge of the tape measure with the seam line. You can't lay it down and do it like that. You won't get an accurate result. And this is a thing that I do. I'm not sure if anyone else does, but because of these metal edges on the tape measure, I usually start my measuring at the 1 and then just remember that I have to subtract an inch when I get my final measurements. So if I start at my notch here and I bring my tape measure around, I come to 3 3/4, which is actually 2 3/4 because I started at the 1. And then I can come back and measure the arm's eye over here. So starting at the 1, I'm making sure that the edge of my tape measure is on the seam line, going all the way around. And again, I end up at 3 3/4, which is 2 3/4. So I know that these seam lines are going to match. And then I just repeat this process for the front. Okay, so now I'm going to check my front. So I want to check this side of the sleeve, so I'm going to be turning it over. I'm going to match my notch with the seam intersection and gradually just pivot it around to see that it matches. And that's how you walk a pattern. It's pretty simple. It does take a little bit of practice with the curves, especially if you've got two curves that are going in opposite directions, like on a princess seam. But with a little practice, you can get it. And as I said, if you are having trouble with the pivoting part, you can always use your tape measure on end to measure those seams and check if they match. I hope you enjoyed learning how to walk a pattern with me. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up and share. If you haven't already subscribed, please do so and hit the notification bell so you always know when I post new content. I have a lot of exciting videos planned for the new year. I'm going to be doing a steampunk series, and along with the video series, there's going to be new steampunk patterns available on my website. I'm also going to be doing a series on how to make a centaur. I've had a lot of requests from people to do a video series on how I made this guy, so I've got that in the works as well. Happy holidays, everybody, and we'll see you soon. Thanks for watching.